Can you imagine this scene? You tune into the morning news just in time to see a breaking story. The Pope, he arrived in the tarmac in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv for all of a sudden an unscheduled visit. The Prime Minister's office hears about it. They send their spokesperson in the Foreign Office to find out what's going on. There's no information. Why is the Pope in Israel? The cameras are rolling. The Pope comes off the plane, enters the Pope mobile, and his entourage makes it all the way to Jerusalem, to the Western Wall. The Pope comes out, and he requests for a meeting with the chief rabbi of the Kotel. And you know what? Do you know what he says to him? I want to tell you why I'm here now. The Pope's, who's the leader of over 1 billion Catholics, says, I have come here today to declare that God of Israel is the only true God, and I want to convert to Judaism. You would tell me, Rabbi, this sounds absurd. Come on. But if you think about it, that's really what happened in this week's Torah portion. There was a man named Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. In Hebrew is Yisro. He arrives at the place where the Jewish people were camping in the desert. Who was he? The Torah tells us he's a Kohen Midyan, which means a religious leader, a theologian of international renown. This was a man who had studied every religion on the face of the earth. Not only that, he actually tried each of these religions. There wasn't even one idol he didn't bow down to, a deity that he hadn't worshipped. He was the monk of all monks, the guru of all gurus, and yet here he arrives in the desert heat to join the newly freed Jewish people and to declare to the world, Ata Yadaiti, which means, now I know that the God of Israel is a greater than all the deities. He had the authority to say it because he actually tried them all. But what happened that now he says, now I know? I mean, after such a spiritual journey that he tried every idol in the world, what finally convinced him that the Jewish people is the true faith? I mean, what did he see in Judaism that he never saw before? And why didn't he see it until now? Rashi, the famous commentary, explains that Yisro actually saw two particular events. One was the splitting of the sea, and one was the Jewish nation's war with Amalek. Now, you may say, come on. I mean, Yisro, this guy, man, he has been around the block. He studied the teachings of monotheism espoused by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, sure, during all those years that Moses lived with him for 60 years before he became leader. They had time to discuss the central tenets of the Jewish faith. I mean, after all, Moses was a great scholar. He was the head of the tribe of Levi. I mean, who no doubt could hold his own theological debate. So if that didn't convince Yisro about the truth of Judaism till now, why was he suddenly so excited? And if it's simply he was impressed by the great miracles that God performed for the Jewish people during the Exodus, why was it that the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek, those two events that actually impressed him more than anything else? Now, perhaps maybe you can say we understand why the splitting of the sea got him excited. I mean, this is a fantastic miracle that took place not only actually in the sea there, but it says all waters in the world split at that same moment, the same time that the sea split for the Jewish people. It was actually such a great miracle that even 40 years later, Joshua took the people to the land of Israel. What did he do first? It says in the book of Joshua, he sent 2 spies in preparation for conquering the land, and they met their host called Rachav, and she said, I agree to host you, because I remember the fear that the nations of the world had many years earlier when the sea split. And so she said to the men, I know that God has given you the land, and that your terror has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melted away before you. That's what she says to the 2 spies. Why are we so afraid? Because we heard how God dried up the water of the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. All right, fine. But what about the war with Amalek? What was so amazing about it? I mean, if anything, one would think that hearing about the war with Amalek would lessen Yisro's appreciation for Jews and Judaism. You know why? Because Amalek was the guy who poured cold water on the whole miracle of the Exodus and the Jewish people. He's the one that showed that it's possible to start up with him. And it's not like the Jewish people easily crushed him. I mean, it's true the Jews won the battle, but they never really quite won the war. And we know Amalek continued to live on. Their descendants, in many generations later, continue to look for ways to harm the Jewish people, God forbid. As we see over the generations, all those that tried to harm the Jews, including Haman and others, were descendants of Amalek. So what is actually the meaning of Rashi's remark that nothing besides the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek convinced Yisro of Ata Yadaiti, that God of Israel is true? So a famous rabbi called the Ksav Sofer, and he was the son of the Chassam Sofer from Bratislava, he actually shares a fascinating and moving explanation, which I think you'll enjoy, and it's actually applicable to our lives. He says like this: think about where Yisro was coming from. He was a religious leader. He was a guru in his own right. I mean, Yisro wasn't really someone who's going to be impressed by theology and spirituality. I mean, these are things that he'd been exploring and experiencing his whole life. What really impressed Yisro was actually the Jewish approach of not only preaching lofty spiritual ideals and profound religious values, but actually taking the lesson learned from those values and living them in daily life. He saw that Jews not only appreciate the greatness of God, but they actually see that greatness of God in this world, and they accept that every person is also divine, has a spark of godliness within them, and must be treated as such. How did Yisro see it? It wasn't when he did his dissertation on some Abrahamic monotheistic theory. And it wasn't when he saw God smash the Egyptians and in Egypt and take the Jews through the impenetrable barrier that was the Egyptian border. You know when it was? It was only after he heard about the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek. And only after he saw the contrast between these two events. Because when Yisro heard about the sea splitting, it seemed impressive. Wow, cool, But he wasn't convinced yet. In fact, maybe he found it a bit suspect. I mean, why didn't these people, the Jewish people, who are being chased by the Egyptian army, who harassed them for so long, coming and running them into the sea, why didn't the Jewish people turn around to fight? Think about it. Why did Moshe, instead of relying on some outlandish miracle that the sea is going to part and allow them to cross on dry land, why didn't he say to the Jewish people, guys, get up and defend yourselves and do away with the Egyptians, or at least try? I mean, since when do we run away from our problems to run into the sea when the Egyptians are running after them? Since when do we run away from the problems and simply rely on God to make miracles? And a month later, after they crossed the sea, came the war with Amalek. This time, when the Jews were attacked, they fought back. So Yisro now sees that if the people didn't fight the Egyptians at the sea, it wasn't because they were weak. It wasn't because they were fearful. It was for an entire different reason. You see, it says in the book of Deuteronomy, the Jewish people are commanded, do not detest an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in this land. What does that mean? The Talmud says, very simply, don't throw a rock in the cistern that gave you water to drink. Like don't spit into the bowl of cereal that you ate that fed you. It means that all of the Egyptians, they enslaved the Jews, they persecuted the Jews. We can't just simply write them off. Why? Because at the end of the day, when we were desperate, in the time of famine, they actually welcomed us to Egypt. They allowed us to live there in prosperity for over 100 years before the slavery began. I know this sounds a bit extreme, but this is how a Jew thinks. You don't have to love the Egyptian. You don't have to tell him what he did was fine. And we can just put it behind us. But your job is not to detest him. God wants us to be able to appreciate the good we've experienced and to give credit where credit is due. We can step back and let God worry about justice. For a Jew must always be able to recognize good. And this, friends, is what impressed Yisro. A nation that can see the positive even in the darkest situation means a nation for whom God is truly real. And only if you believe that God exists, and only if you believe that He is real and present in your own life, can you let go even of a most legitimate grievance. Not because it's okay to hurt you, but because you can put it into God's hands. The God of such a nation, Yisrael realized, must truly be greater than all other deities. Let me share with you a story. One day in the early 90s, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who was then the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and later he became the chief rabbi of Israel, he was sitting in his office. One day, a distinguished-looking Hasidic Jew from London walks in. His name was Matel Kaminsky. He handed Rabbi Lau a new book that he was about to publish. And he says, Rabbi Lau, I'm also a Holocaust survivor. I've written an autobiography, and I've come from London to Israel to show it to you. And also I want to tell you, Rabbi Lau, I've come to ask you for forgiveness. Rabbi Lau was intrigued. Who was this man? What's his story? And why did he feel the need to apologize? Well, Matel says, Rabbi Lau, I want to share with you a story. And this brought Rabbi Lau to a dark and painful 50 years earlier. He tells him it was October 1942, and the Nazis prowled around the Polish town of Piotrków. And they engaged in one of their infamous actions. They gathered all the men into the town square to await transportation to the death camp of Treblinka. Yet the women and children, they left home, planning to deal with them later on. Late that night, the town rabbi, Reb Moshe Chaim Lau, who was the father of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, he somehow managed to make his way through the darkness, and he snuck back home where his wife and young child remained in fear. He desperately whispered that he arranged for them to hide in an attic in an old rickety building somewhere else in town, and that they should hurry quickly and stay there until things quieted down. And then, explaining that he had to return before the Nazis noticed that the town's rabbi was missing, which could anger the Nazis and lead, God forbid, to further harm of the rest of the men waiting in the town square. So he quickly bid them farewell, and he disappeared as quickly as he arrived. And by the way, that was the last time his son, Rabbi Yisrael Meir, saw his father. This one young boy, Yisrael, and his mother, they crammed into a tiny little attic. It was so hard, they were saying. There were 10 more people in this attic, including this man who's telling the rabbi the story of Matel. He was a young boy, he says. I had no parents, and I was with you in the attic. And he says one day the adults were terrified to hear they heard Nazis entering the house, and they could hear the boots getting closer, and they could feel death approaching. They tried maintaining some sense of normalcy and calm. So the Rebbetzin, the mother of Yisrael, kept a bag with some apples, which she fed to her son Yisrael to keep him distracted. Now Matel, he's telling the story to Rabbi Lau. I was a young boy there, an orphan. I was hungry. And I saw your bag of apples, and I decided to sneak out an apple from your bag, which I bit into. But at that very moment that I bit into the apple, everyone in the attic heard the unmistakable sound of the Nazis entering the very room from which the attic could be accessed. The fear was palpable. Nobody made a peep. Matel knew he couldn't chew the apple that was in his mouth because the noise would mean certain death for them all. He also couldn't spit it out because then everyone would see that he had taken an apple from someone else. And he says, Rabbi Lau, this apple remained like that in my mouth for 2 hours as the Nazis searched the room, removing the floorboard in the search for Jews. But they didn't realize that these Jewish people were there, who were shivering in silence. The Nazis didn't find them. And now Matel is standing in front of Rabbi Lau telling him this story to apologize for taking his food without asking. And he says, Rabbi Lau, please forgive me. For 50 years, this has been bothering me. Rabbi Lau couldn't contain his emotions. Burst into tears. Of course, forgiving the man. On the spot right there for the story, which he wasn't even aware of until this very moment. Friends, this question was also asked by the Rebbe. And he asked, what was so special about the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek? And the answer the Rebbe gave actually complements this what the Ksav Sofer said. And it actually gives a profound appreciation what it is exactly that Judaism gave the world. And the Rebbe says, Yisrael was a colorful man. What does it mean? He was a religious guru. He knew all the idols. But according to the Midrash, he was also a political leader. He combined the philosophy of Socrates with the political and social acumen of Julius Caesar. A millennia before either of them was born. But it was a rare combination. The ability to be a philosopher and a theologian. True. But unlike those who remained in the ivory towers of academia, in addition to being a philosopher, Yisro's theological vision also inspired and was inspired by a vision for ordinary mundane life. What does it mean? Yisro believed that there's supposed to be a bridge connecting profound theology with practicality, that ideas are supposed to come to life, that politics and governance is born of philosophy and ideology. So thus, the two explanations, actually he was called Yisrei Kohen Midyan. What does it mean, Kohen Midyan? One explanation says a Kohen means a political minister. It means a government leader of status. According to another opinion, it means a religious minister, like a priest, a man of cloth. But the truth is that Yisro was both. And all his life he was looking for a way to bridge these two identities. But he was never able to find it. He tried every religion. He met every greatest spiritual leader that there was. And he immersed himself in the study of values like humility and abstinence, sufficing with very little, caring for family, respect for others. And he found people who espoused these ideals. They loved them. But you know what the problem was? People didn't live their life that way. They spoke about it. They talked about it on stage. But when nobody was looking, they really weren't so compelled by these ideals to overcome their instinctive animal desires and live them by them. In the abstract, they were gung-ho about morality. But as they say, when push came to shove, a human being is a human being. And the Rebbe, on numerous occasions, shared the story of Aristotle. Famous story where his students once found him casually tearing a leg off a live rabbit and he was eating it right in front of them. Aristotle to do something like that? They were shocked. They said, you're Aristotle, the very paragon of morality and the standard bearer of a higher form of living. How could you do this, tear the leg off an animal and eat it? Aristotle, he was unconcerned. And he said as follows, when I sit in the class and lecture about morality, I'm Aristotle. But right now, I'm not Aristotle. You know, you can really know a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean you know how to apply it. As the saying goes, I was a great parent until I had kids. This was the struggle Yisro kept running to in his journey. The giant gulf between heaven and earth. And according to the Midrash, Yisro was actually contemporary of the villain wicked man by the name of Balaam. They had both previously were, years before, Yisro and Balaam, the one who tried to curse the Jewish people, they were advisors to the king. This wicked man Balaam, also he knew a few things about spirituality. They used to say he was after all a prophet. He saw him converse with God. He was a spiritual man in theory, but you look at his behavior, all he cared about was money and fame and lust. For the right number of bags of gold, he was perfectly happy to try and use his spiritual connections to curse an entire nation who had done him no wrong, like Balak tried to hire Balaam to curse, but it didn't work. But for money, he tried. And when he failed to harm them with his curses and spiritual designs, he decided to ensnare them in a web of immorality. because it suited his needs. And all this from a prophet? I mean, talk about cognitive dissonance. But Yisro felt it. Yisro felt it could and should be otherwise. He understood that the truth is the truth. It's not based on conveniences. It's not based limited on to the classroom. I mean, if heaven is real, it's real, even on earth. And Yisro spent his whole life trying to prove that harmony could exist between the two worlds. Now, Judaism is where he found it. Because Judaism is the religion that teaches, as the Talmud says, that Torah study is great. Why? Because Shemevi l'dei Maisa, Torah study brings to action. To learn, to be spiritual is great, but it's designed to affect and produce our deeds. Only when the abstract ideas come to concrete life does all the spirituality have any real values. If it remains in the abstract, it doesn't accomplish anything. And Judaism is the brilliant path of translating lofty values into mundane minutites of everyday life. The Torah study is spiritual, but it's really tied and connected to all the things we do as human beings. It governs monetary transactions, the food we eat, sexuality, and everything else is all governed in the Torah. Because what is a mitzvah? Mitzvah is not just a commandment. It's actually infusing godliness into our own lives. For example, the mitzvah of returning a lost object is an expression of the ideal of caring for the property of others. The mitzvah of guarding your eyes from seeing evil is about living a pure, holy life, even when nobody's watching, and keeping even the mind pure. Because the kosher laws demonstrate that eating is not just a material pursuit. It can and must serve as a spiritual end. For example, Shabbos teaches us that even though we work 6 days a week, to build this world and support our families and communities, that's where we work. There's something that transcends and elevates all that. Why do Jewish people, why do Jewish values stick to our actions rather than remaining abstract? Because in the Torah, the schism between heaven and earth is merely perceived. The truth is that both are created by God and for a single divine purpose, and are thus two ingredients. One is spiritual and one is material. Both are the same divine dish. What's going on here? Before Judaism, there was a notion that just seemed too true to believe. Everyone was busy picking a side. There were those who wanted spirituality. They were busy blotting out anything material. Those who wanted materiality were busy blotting out all traces of morality and spirituality. You have a guy like Bilam, the wicked man, who looks up at heavens. He sees what's going on there, and he says, okay, no thanks, not for me. And he spends his whole life trying to erase from his mind any shred of moral conscience by getting more and more involved in his pursuit of physical pleasure. Because only in this way could he reconcile the notion that this physical world has any value at all. So what Judaism brought and brings to the world was and is the idea of living your life in this world. But why? Not just live to live, but live for the sake of heaven. God created a material world. He wants us to live in it, to partake in it, to engage in it materially. For what purpose? To fulfill the divine mission that he entrusted to you and to I. What does it mean? 6 days a week, you work. You rest on the 7th. You take home a nice paycheck. You use it to help others. In Judaism, Yisro found the bridge that he was looking for. To the ability for a Jew to live through the hell of the Holocaust, lose his entire family, and all he worries about is what? Is an apple that he, a starving boy, took from another. The ability to bridge the eternal faith with practical life. The ability for a chief rabbi and a Jew from London to live on earth while simultaneously living a life of heaven. That's what Yisro was seeking. And that's what Yisro found in the Jewish people. When did he finally recognize this concept? what Judaism is all about, prompting him to drop everything and join the Jews in the desert? When did Yisrael get to that moment? When he heard about two specific events: the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek. Because only when we, as a people, only when taken together, do these events unequivocally show the universality of the Jewish way. For the splitting of the sea symbolized engagement with the forces of reality, their readiness to march through raging waters without the fear or the sense of purpose. But even after the Jews marched into the sea, Yisrael still wasn't convinced. I mean, does a Jew, he says, march into the world because he's infused with the spirituality of a divine mission? Or maybe simply because he couldn't shake off his slave mentality from Egypt and is just right now simply still taking orders without asking, running away from the darkness? Why? Because he cannot or is too insecure to light up? Came along the story of Amalek. And this story of Amalek, that he provoked the Jewish people. And when a Jew acts in this world, it is divinely inspired. Because how did we win the war with Amalek? With spiritual inspiration. It says when Moshe would raise his hands, the Jews found themselves stronger. When he put his hands down, Amalek got the upper hand. And perhaps the Jews on earth were on the battleground, but the war was being waged by Moshe in the spiritual realms. Only Moshe could do it. And so, friends, Yisrael understood that a leader like Moshe and people like Moshe's people are capable of straddling both worlds. On the one hand, Moshe, he was present in the highest of heavens. He can wage a war on spiritual terms. But also, Moshe had his feet planted on the ground with the ability to lead his people through the challenges of daily life with common sense and equanimity, informed and inspired by the Torah. And finally, Yisro saw that in Judaism, God is real in heaven and on earth. And that was for him, the one who knew every idol in the world, for him now to proclaim, Ata Yadaiti, now I know that the God of Israel is greater than all the other deities. May it be revealed for all the worlds to see, to know and live by, with the coming of the ultimate redemption speedily in our days. Amen.